Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. Your host, Erin Pizzey, opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men's suffering.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue, and never was. It's a generational issue. Feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Saturday, March 15th, 2014 edition of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I, as per usual, am your co-host, Dean Esme, speaking to you from the wilds of suburban Detroit, Michigan. With me, as always, our host, Erin Pizzey, calling from London. How are you this morning, Erin, this afternoon?
I'm fine. You've got a most beautiful, beautiful spring day, and all my daffodils are out.
Oh, excellent. Oh, you plant daffodils, do you?
Yeah, and tulips.
Oh, wonderful. I have no feel for gardening myself whatsoever. I think I don't have a green thumb. I have a black one, I think. But in any case, that's all right. So it's pretty nice here too. We've had numerous blizzards and snowstorms lately. Both real and metaphorical. I'm pleased to say that joining us today on Revelations with Erin Pizzey is Barbara Kay, columnist for the National Post. Barbara is also the author of a book from Freedom Press Canada called Acknowledgements, a Cultural Memoir and Other Essays. I'll go ahead and repeat that for anybody who wants to pick it up. It's called Acknowledgements, a Cultural Memoir and Other Essays, published by Freedom Press by Barbara Kay, K-A-Y. And I believe Barbara is on the phone with us now. Hello, Barbara, are you there?
Hi, Dean. How are you?
Pretty darn good. How are you?
I'm very well.
It's an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, thank you. I'm looking out at a very white, wintry scene here in the Laurentian Mountains in Quebec. It's very bright and sunny, and we still have tons of snow, and it's very cold.
Well, I suppose being up here in Michigan, I'm used to complaining about snow, but probably those of you up in Montreal laugh at us because you get it even colder up there, I imagine. So, Barbara, I've been a fan of your column for at least a few years, and Erin tells me she's been reading your writings for a few years. That's true, yes, Erin?
Absolutely, yes. And we're also part of the women's group, the leading women's group for shared parenting, both of us.
Yes, and thank you very much for being part of my reading public. I appreciate that, and yes, and I'm a big fan of Erin's work as well. So we're friends across the ocean without having actually met.
Well, that may get fixed at some point this year. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In the meantime, I'd like to ask, since you both went ahead and mentioned leading women for shared parenting, We did a show about that about a month ago, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it again. Why don't you tell us about your interest in leading women for shared parenting and what you guys are up to?
Are you asking me?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, I think this is an idea whose time came, and a very enterprising guy named Terry Brennan came to me with this thought that if we're going to make headway with issues that have a huge impact on men's lives, custody issues and domestic violence and all the rest that you've discussed so often, the impetus really has to come from women because the general public does not really listen to men voicing complaints about their own lives. And they do tend to listen more when they hear women, especially women, not myself, I'm a journalist, but women who make up this wonderful board who have had such authoritative and credible CVs, lawyers and activists and people like Erin who have devoted their lives to this subject, so much of their careers. And when they hear these people, legislators, speaking up for it, they prick up their ears and say, well, look, this isn't only about men complaining for the sake of it. This is, these women are taking this injustice seriously. And, well, maybe we have to listen to these voices. So I think it was a great idea. We have a very large board now, international, people from Europe and Australia and of people whose careers and credibility is really quite marvelous. So I'm very happy to be associated with that group.
I would only give you a moderate amount of pushback in that I'm 48 and I've been following these issues for more than 20 years at this point. And while there was a time when what you said was 100% correct, I would have to say now what you're saying is more like 50% correct. It is still true that people have trouble listening when women speak, but we are seeing rising voices among men as part of what A Voice for Men is all about and part of its success. Men are speaking up in their own voices again now, and sometimes they're angry, and people should respect that they have a reason for it. That said, I happen to have always believed that it's absolutely vital that women's voices are part of it. You are, last I checked, about half the human race, and without your voices, it's not going to matter. In fact, in most modern countries, most of the countries you mentioned, if not all of them, women are a majority of voters, which means if women don't care, nothing's going to happen. So I salute and applaud you for that, both of you for that. Barbara, you were telling me a few days ago that in Canada in particular on March 25th there's a big event coming up. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is a bill for a private member's bill for shared parenting as a default in post-separation arrangements for children. This is an idea that is very much in the air all over the world. And this Maurice Vellacott, the member of parliament who has been promoting this bill for some time, has been trying for years to get this on the table. So it's having its second reading debate next on March 25th, and I'll be writing a column about that this week. So there is a good chance because, in fact, none of the political parties is against the bill, and it is the platform. It is on the platform of several of the parties. So I think there's a pretty good chance that it may pass, and it's only been around for the last 20 years, the idea, which, I suppose for politics isn't so terrible, and I'm hoping it will pass. So I will, be part of that debate, and we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, we had Paulette McDonald from Leading Women for Shared Parenting on about a month ago, and she was telling us that historically efforts to even get this out for a public debate and vote were basically torpedoed by, to put it kindly, let's say some shenanigans, and they essentially closed business in Parliament before it could actually be read out. And It looks like they probably won't be able to get away with that this time. They being, well, who would they be? Let's just say whoever wants it not to be talked about hopefully won't get their way this time, and it probably will go to a vote.
Yes,
Let's hope so.
I think at the parliamentary level, you don't have very many voices raised in protest. The protest against this bill comes from the usual suspects, from radical ideologues, and of course from those most financially invested in the adversarial process, which are family lawyers. So you do see columns and op-eds written by them, some of them, and they make themselves sound very reasonable, and we should be cautious and try other things. But in general, I would say the volatility of the issue has died down because poll after poll shows widespread popular support for this idea. It makes sense to people, and I think ordinary people recognize that the roles of fathers have changed so dramatically. Even in the last 20 years, it's now not unusual at all to see dads as the primary caretakers for their children. And I think that reasonable people have, back this idea. So, yes, I feel optimistic.
It's interesting that you say it's a private member's bill. Now, if I understand the parliamentary system correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, what this means is that no political party is necessarily behind it, but rather an individual member of parliament is able to bring it out for a debate and discussion. And if I understand that also means that, do they have what's called a conscience vote there in the Parliament of Canada?
Yes, they do. And the good thing about a private bill is that you don't have the party in power coming out and saying, this is what we are going to do. In other words, it's not something that a party is imposing. This is a kind of friendly and non-authoritarian way to get an idea whose time has come onto the floor and make it a non-partisan kind of affair. And I'm very happy. It takes longer to get a private member's bill on the table because, you can keep pushing them back. I mean, the government's own preferences obviously will take priority. But when it does eventually get there, it's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, and it also would mean, theoretically, to oppose it, a party would actually have to come up and say, we take a strong stance against this.
And they have to have a reason for it. And I don't think there's much that they can come up with.
Well, we'll see. We've certainly seen what some of the feminist groups have had to say, and it's all, I'm trying not to be rude about it, but really very hateful and bigoted, and saying this is going to allow abusive men to have their children and other such horrible things. But for the most part, there isn't. It does show, the surveys actually show broad support across the board. I will mention, as I always do, here in the States we have a bit of a problem in that many of the various states have what they call shared parenting, but in the estimate of most people, it's not really shared parenting, because what they mean by shared parenting here in the States is, oh yes, both parents will make the important medical and educational decisions together, but still the children will only see their father every other weekend and perhaps one day every 2 weeks for dinner or something, and that's not shared parenting.
Well, that's why the words parenting time are very important to be in the legislation. In when you say shared parenting, it means you have to have that word time in there to indicate that it means actual time spent with the children.
That's right. And any reasonable take on shared parenting is 50-50, or I think the psychologists I've talked to have said, a minimum of something like a 70-30 ratio is realistic. And it is more fair to men that way, and the children, because we know that in these shared parenting arrangements, the children usually wind up better off. And even for the man, I mean, speaking from the man's perspective, let's even pretend the mother is the primary caregiver and spends most of the time with the children. That usually means he's off at work all day, and at least he gets to see his children when he comes home. and to then be divorced and say, well, no, you're not even going to see your children when you come home. You're going to see them less than ever. That's just a horrible thing to do psychologically to a man, and makes him incapable of being a good father in many ways.
Indeed. I think that Edward Kruk, who was our Canada expert in child custody, his cutoff for bonding, for effective bonding is, 35-40% of the time has to be spent so that a child will bond. I think that in Australia it's 35% of the time is there in their 2005 bill, I believe. Anyways, definitely, you cannot establish a relationship, parent and a child, with something like 15, 10, 15, even 20%, which is even more than what many parents, many dads especially, get with their children.
Well, so if you are Canadian, then regardless of what political party you are a member of, or whether you consider yourself conservative, left-wing, right-wing, libertarian, whatever it is, shouldn't matter. I think we should encourage you to call or write your member of parliament, no matter what party they're in, and voice your support for this. And is there something about it on the Leading Women for Shared Parenting site?
I'm sure there must be, but Canadians can certainly find out more about it at the Council for Equal Parenting of Canada. Am I right? CEPC. I think it's Council, or I think it's the CEPC. Anyway, if you Google, Shared Parenting Canada, you'll definitely get their website.
Yep, it's CanadianEPC.org.
Yes.
CanadianEPC.org.
Yes, the Canadian Parenting Committee or Council, yes.
Council. Yep, I'm looking at the website now, so just to repeat for everybody, CanadianEPC.org. And also, hopefully, Barbara says, you say you'll have a column up about this in the next week or so in the National Post?
Yes, I'm intending to write about it this week.
We'll also make sure to get something about that up on the front page of A Voice for Men, where we have a strong Canadian contingent, a surprisingly strong Canadian contingent, where even though we're based out of Houston, Texas, I'd say a good 20% of our most active and vocal members are Canadian. And so we have those of us who are interested in men's issues and children's issues in the U.S. have a lot to learn from you Canadians, it seems.
We're an organized group, it seems. I'm very pleased, actually, to know that Canada is a strong voice in this movement. I've personally met so many wonderful people through this topic, and people that are very determined, intelligent, and have gone about things in a very non-confrontational but persistent way. And I think really the methodology of those who have organized around this topic is actually a very good role model for people in other places where maybe the organization isn't so strong.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm going to ask Erin about this because it's so weird for me to hear this, because I remember even before I got to know Erin, one of her most famous observations was Canada is just the worst country in the world when it comes to these sorts of things. And you did say that, didn't you, Erin?
Yeah, I did. But I do think Canada was really funded. Its women's movement was funded very well from the Trudeau times, wasn't it, Barbara?
Oh, yes.
And in a sense, that huge packet of money that was handed over meant that they all got dug in long before they did in other countries. And the hold has been so tight.
That's true. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, the radical feminist movement in Canada, very, very strong, very organized, and got tremendous amounts, not only of money, but I think our Status of Women committee, very well funded with top feminists in it. And then they produced in the 1990s, 1994, I think it was, this Canadian the report on violence against women in the family came out, and it was tremendously influential in kind of entrenching the notion that there was a war on women and it needed to be fought and it needed government resources to do it. And since Canadians are extremely comfortable with government, taking the lead on issues of social justice. So we had, LEAF, this legal fund funded by the government, which was solely for the purpose of fighting in court for women, any women that had, issues. So that they would come to the rescue for women who had usual complaints, but nobody was coming. No funded legal aid was available for men. So yes, we had. I think that's what motivated the strong organizations we have now is this sense of righteous indignation about the huge disparity in treatment between men and women by our government.
Yeah, Erin called it the women's movement, but I'm no longer. I bristle a bit when I hear that phrase, just because I don't think it should have been called the women's movement at all. It was the feminist movement, and feminism does not and never has, as an ideology, spoken for all women.
Well, actually, Dean, as far as I can remember, and I'm now 75, it was originally marketed as the women's liberation movement.
That's right.
Yeah, for quite a long time. Yeah, so if you remember, most
yes,
of us
were
thinking in terms of equality for women and all the reasons why we felt it would be a very good idea. Then we were sold a bill of goods, really. Our problem in England is slightly different, Barbara. One of the difficulties for women in Parliament is that our Parliament is actually very much male-dominated, even in the way it runs, because it assumes that most MPs, members of Parliament, will have 2 or 3 jobs and directorships. So the House mostly sits in the afternoon and late evening. Then the Member of Parliament has 1 day a week when he has to, or she has to be in her constituency to take care of all her people. So it's almost impossible for a woman with children to actually fulfill a role. And we are lamentably short of women in our Parliament. It's appalling. And also, which makes it even harder, we have a very hardcore Harriet Harman and all the women, the radical feminist women, who will not have shared parenting. And the usual thing comes out, men, how many men kill women? And there's no mention of how many women kill men, how many men abuse and kill children, how many times the children have been killed on contact. Most of the figures are actually made up, but it still terrifies the public. And we have a very, very strong feminist history of women journalists.
That's very interesting. We also have very strong women journalists in Canada, most of whom are quite feminist. Although I have to say, in the last decade, I have seen most of the radical feminists who were journalists are no longer writing for their newspapers. Some have been fired. Some have gotten into trouble over one thing or another and sort of left in disgrace. And I would say that the women journalists in Canada today, most are still liberal or on the left, but they are nowhere near as radical as they used to be. And I kind of see a shift in Canada. The whole country has kind of shifted rightward in any case because we've elected a conservative government twice in a row. And so we are supportive in general of a more conservative view of life than we had a decade ago. And I think that has filtered. There's more reasonable voices in the air than there used to be. I see a falling off from the kind of hysteria that you're describing. We don't have a Harriet Harman type. I know that name very well because she has such an appalling record of anti-male and anti-family ideas and her personal history going back to her involvement in that pedophile.
Yes, that was disgusting.
Disgusting. Yeah. Okay, but still, a woman like that shouldn't even still be in Parliament. I think somebody with her history in Canada, you see, would have been felt quite disgraced, and I don't think public opinion would have allowed her to continue with that at that level of power. Certainly she would not be a cabinet minister. That's 100%. So I'm very glad to hear this view of, the difference between our two parliaments and the whole mood that creates.
Well, it's interesting when you say conservative, Barbara, because
well, not by American standards, Dean.
yes, exactly. I was going to point out that a conservative Canadian is probably well to the left of Barack Obama on any number of issues.
No, I won't go that far. What I would say is that a conservative Canadian, conservative Canadians are not crazy about Obama at all. And I would say there would probably be called centrist. I mean, he's quite far left, so I think we would be called centrists in the United States.
Yeah, well, he's far left on some things, but then again, when you look at his foreign policy, I've heard Canadian conservatives and liberals both say he's far right wing. I think my point was what conservative means to Canadians is not necessarily what conservative means elsewhere.
Oh, you're right there. You're quite right there.
And that to me points to the silliness of any ideology, really. What conservative means to you versus what it means to me. Well, I'm fond of the dictionary definition of conservative, which means moderate and not prone to jumping on change too radically, skeptical of radical change. Then again, the dictionary definition of liberal is open-minded and amenable to change. Yeah. Neither one of those.
Yeah, maybe 60 years ago that was the case, but the word liberal now has been appropriated by people from the far left. And I mean, liberal used to be somebody like Jack Kennedy, who was extremely patriotic and a very muscular patriot, and that certainly doesn't describe liberals today. So we could go on and on about what liberal means, progressive, all these things, but let's just say, for me, conservative means, as you say, moderate, reasonable, and non-ideological. Seeing social change come about organically and not from top-down theories imposed on the public.
Well, and that's sort of what ideological feminism has always been, hasn't it? And more of an ideology,
but it's a left-wing ideology. It's based in Marxism and this idea that there's a constant oppressed class and an oppressor class, and without a revolution you can never do anything about that. And it doesn't matter if a little blood flows because, you know, how can you make an omelet without breaking eggs and all this kind of thing. And the unrelentingness of this message that there have to be victims and there have to be oppressors, as if this is the whole story of mankind. You know, the radicals teaching in the universities are extreme leftists, as well as, you know, feminism is simply another left-wing ideology, and it's just been one of the more successful ones. Communism has fallen away. I mean, Stalinist communism has fallen away, but its Marxist base is still there. It's still present. You know,
but it's more effective in many ways, because I always thought that when they changed the goalposts from capitalism and the women in the early 70s turned on the men of the left, in a sense, it took the heart out of all our left-wing movements here in this country. Suddenly, the whole thing just was distraught. So now it's a much easier battle, because if you say it's patriarchy, therefore it's all men who are bent on destroying women and their children, and then, like Harriet Harman, you make the pronouncement in 1990 that the new family setup from now on is going to be women and children. And in our country, we even pay for the women to be able to have their children without men.
So it has become also funded here. IVF, well, I mean, it wasn't meant to be for that purpose particularly, but IVF in Quebec is funded, not in the rest of Canada so much.
In vitro
but if you say like Harriet did, that the new family unit would be women and children because men aren't necessarily harmonious to family life, effectively, you and publicly, you destroy the whole concept of the family. And she's done that. And indeed, she and her fellow feminists have been hugely successful in this country.
Well, I know a few of our British friends will be rolling their eyes. I know at least one, Ali Fogg, he writes on men's issues somewhat sympathetically from a left-wing point of view and would be screaming, "What are you talking about? David Cameron and his conservative government are in charge now. Harriet Harman has no influence." But
that's
I
not
call
true.
nonsense.
That's not true. It's rubbish.
Yeah.
Absolute rubbish.
Her party may not be in power, but the influence of the ideological feminism is such that David Cameron himself even recently came out and said he was a feminist.
And let's just remember their wives, Dean.
Yes.
Let's remember their wives.
And don't forget, too, in the civil service, feminists are well entrenched because of equity employment laws. This is exactly the way ideologues get into the public service. They people the halls, it's like yes minister, the minister can be conservative, liberal, whatever he wants, but it's the civil service that runs the country.
That's right.
And also, it's also for us, probably like you. I mean, our whole of our judiciary is actually mined with radical feminists. Now, the problem we have here, I don't know what it's like for you, but what we have here is that if we get shared parenting, timely shared parenting, then this whole business, something that grew up, I imagine, for good reasons, which was the best interests of the child, in this country has been misappropriated and handed over to the judges and the judiciary and the state. Therefore, once best interests of the child became policy, what the parents wanted didn't matter. What happened is that the people who made the decisions about their children is the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
and this is very frightening.
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute just because I think it's important the audience understand. You will hear the buzzword best interests of the child bandied about quite frequently by a lot of these ideologues and a lot of the people in government, in the civil service, not necessarily the politicians. And best interests of the child has morphed from what it sounds like it means, which is the best interests of the child, to a very narrow definition of whatever seems most convenient to the state functionaries. And it almost always winds up with this ridiculous default now of get as much money as you can out of the father and otherwise give him as little time as you can with his children. And the results have been disastrous because they really aren't in the best interests of the child. So in a very Orwellian way, best interests of the child frequently are not in the best interests of the child. And I know
But my point is that if we can get shared parenting, then majority of normal families breaking up will actually be able to quite happily avoid the courts and perhaps just use mediation. We will always have a few couples who essentially aren't capable of making decisions in a mature way, and they will still continue in the courts. But I'm hoping in the future, long after I'm gone, the courts won't deal with human issues at all in any circumstances because it's never been the right place.
I quite agree. I think the whole idea that judges should be in charge of people's lives. As one family law person here said, it's never about giving custody to one person. It's always about taking away from another. And you are always the idea that any state functionary can take a child away from his parent for any reason other than that the child needs protection. I should point out that even child services, and you could do a lot of criticism of child services because they make some dreadful errors, but their mandate is not to take a child away from his parents unless the child is in need of protection, and that means protection from abuse. So the judge should be operating on the same principle, that no child should be removed from his parents' emotional and physical orbit unless that child is in need of protection. And that's what shared parenting really is about.
Yeah, I would say that. I think it's important. Part of recognizing that is going to be recognizing that unless there is documentable evidence of, imminent and genuine harm to the child, removing the child from either of its parents should be acknowledged as a form of child abuse all by itself.
I mean, we should retire the phrase give custody, because how can you give something that was never not given? I mean, both parents had this child, and now you are giving one to the other, the child to one or the other. You can't do that. You can only take away from one. And all you're saying is you had 50% of this child, now you've got 100%, and the other person has no percent, basically, because
1%, yes.
Well, I mean, 1% is no percent, because
that's right.
Below a certain amount, it might as well be zero.
That's right. If you see your child every other weekend, you cannot parent the child.
You're not a parent. You're a visitor. And
That's right.
so you've really changed the status. You're changing the status of a human being by taking away his flesh and blood. I think this is quite. It's so barbaric. It's so anti-democratic. It's amazing that people can't see that.
To bring this sort of around to the ideological feminist movement. And by the way, if anybody doubts that ideological feminism has its roots in Marxism, well, we could do a whole show on that, but it does.
They say it themselves. They're not shy.
Yeah.
If you read the literature in women's studies, they're very proud of that. They're very proud to be from the stridently pure left. That's not something they try to hide. They think that's a point of honor.
And you'll have people roll their eyes and say, no, feminism is just about equality. But I'll tell you, I think... read their literature. I don't think there's a single person in this conversation who thinks women should have fewer rights or should have rights stripped away from them. We're not talking about denying equality under the law to anybody.
Well, that kind of goes without saying. I mean, I think
it should, but it seems to be necessary because I get accused all the time when I criticize feminism of wanting to take rights away from women, and it's absurd.
Trying to take? Do they specify what rights you're trying to take away? Do they think that it is a right for women to have sole custody of their children? Is that suddenly an invented right? It isn't. There's no right.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's always incoherent whenever I encounter it. I'm just getting it out there in case somebody who is not aware of these issues and they hear, why are they begging on feminism? Don't they believe in rights for women? It's rather powerful and rather Orwellian use of language they have because, as soon as you ask that direct question, what right am I trying to take away from women? Well, they have no coherent answer.
It's the same kind of stuff you get from people in peace studies. We're peace studies because we're in favor of peace, as opposed to the rest of us who are in favor of war. You know, it's one of those "when did you stop beating your wife" questions. To say, aren't you in favor of peace? Well, of course I'm in favor of peace. You know, but that doesn't. But peace studies is also one of those left wing. Well, anyways, that's a whole other thing. So.
I get what you mean. It's Orwellian twisting of language. It really is. Because I'm going to repeat. Nobody in this conversation is against equal rights under the law for anybody. So, that said, to sort of turn it around, and we have another person I want to bring into this conversation in a minute, and Attila Winzer. One of the ways that radical feminists have been able to get us away from the idea that fathers matter every bit as much in the lives of their children as mothers do, and are in fact desperately needed, and more than as visitors. One of the ways they've managed to divert away attention from that goes right to the heart of Erin Pizzey's entire career, which is domestic violence. And the belief that domestic violence is a patriarchal problem where men beat on women as part of treating them as property. And it's nonsense, isn't it, Erin?
Well, I mean, originally, it was never anything much to do, as far as I could see from the very beginning, the history of it all. It was essentially all about women coming back from the South in America and the civil rights movement, deciding that they wanted a movement of their own, not although this is what it purported to be, to take care of women, but actually to create jobs, which then would be ring-fenced to exclude men. And they set about it, and they've been extremely successful. Look at what's happening in universities with women's studies. Look at what's happening. Look at any part of our society now, and you can see this enormously powerful movement, very subterranean in many cases, but it is powerful, and all of it purports because men are brutal and violent. And it frightens me when young women, and I think I've said this before, come to see me, and they say, but you leave your front door open. Yes. Why shouldn't I leave my front door open? But somebody might come in and hurt you. I know that somebody's supposed to be a man. And this huge fear of men. And I just say, nobody's going to hurt me. You don't have to worry about it. But they've been brainwashed, these young women, to believing that out there the world is a very dangerous place, peopled by batterers and rapists. What do you think about that, Barbara?
Well, I quite agree with you, although I must say I do keep my front door locked, but because there are some bad people out there. But no, I think this new the newest front for fear mongering is this rape culture business on campus, and these astronomically crazy figures that 1 in 4 women is going to be raped on a campus during her stay there, which is it has no basis in fact or evidence, but it is it's I compared it to tulip mania in the 18th century. You know,
yes,
it's a form of delusion, it's a form of hysteria, and it becomes a kind of mass trope. You know, people just take it up. Rape culture. And then, of course, the narratives come forward. I was raped. I was this. And we hear about all these stories of women being raped. And the common basis of them all, so far that I've heard, or almost all, is that they went to a party, they got blind, crazy drunk, they were sleeping with, they don't know how many people they slept with because they'd forgotten. And the next day they've gotten up and felt regretful, or somebody took a photo of them and slut-shamed them on the internet, or for whatever reason, they decided that because they didn't give their consent, or they think they didn't, this is rape. So this is a dumbing down of a very serious crime, but it's now taken over the campuses.
I was reading the new law, whatever it's being passed in California, where the man and a woman have to verbally give each other consent. Have you read about that?
It's even worse than that, Erin. We've had something about it on A Voice for Men, and there'll be more. It's actually a bill to say that you have to prove that you got that consent, or it can be considered rape. So it's not even basically, I guess you're going to have a recording or a signed contract. It's ludicrous, but it's actually being considered by the California Assembly. It's utter madness.
It's being considered on some campuses in Canada, and of course, the whole idea that not giving verbal assent means that whatever then happens is rape is just insane, and a complete perversion of what an intimate experience actually is or should be. So, you know, people think if you keep upping the ante, that somehow they're going to prevent unhappy sexual encounters.
But I don't think it's just upping the ante, Barbara. I think an awful lot of it is about funding and money. Because as long as you can keep a huge section, well, the majority of women in the country, which is the majority, frightened, you can extract money. And particularly from men who will actually hand money over and with the feeling of guilt because of what is happening to women and children. The thing I wanted to ask you, can I just wait a minute, Dean? The thing I wanted to ask you, Barbara, was I get into a lot of trouble when I say this, but I think the books, the 3 books, 50 Shades of Grey, rather make a point of what I've always been saying. One of the things I've always been struck by is how male fantasies, sexual fantasies, are acceptable. Men aren't ashamed of talking about their sexual fantasies, but for women, it's very much a taboo subject, and even among each other. Yes. And I know because I've had a look at Nancy Friday's books of female sexuality fantasy. Now, one of the biggest fantasies, and I've worked with women for over 40 years now, is male rape. The overpowering of the female, which thereby lets her be her wanton self. Now, this is why part of this whole rape argument gets so hysterical, because it does have a kind of Jungian concept underneath it, which is an archetype. And I think that's partly, I haven't shared this with anybody because I don't know who to talk to about it. But essentially, it is part.
I'm glad you're sharing it with me because that is something I also have. I agree with you, but I have not had the courage to ever write. If I wrote that in a column, I doubt if they would. Even my newspaper would probably not publish it. But the funny thing is, but you're right. When women read these books and they get a huge kick out of them, and then you look at something like Harlequin Romance, which sells billions of books, and what is the common theme to every single one of them? You just have to look at the cover. A tall, gorgeous man and a woman bent backwards in his arms with her bodice open and her bosom heaving. This idea of being swept off your feet by a man is really the wish to be, as you say, to be seduced, to be overpowered, to pretend to say no, but really to be saying yes. But women in their hearts know that this is an image that can be very exciting.
And 50 million of them bought the book,
well, yes,
all three
yes.
books.
Of course. Okay,
so I think we stop being ashamed of fantasies and accept them, and then maybe a lot of this hysteria, which is very easily whipped up, would actually have to settle down and become more like a reality.
So if I might ask, what you ladies are suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of this rape hysteria is basically, to some extent, projection.
Yeah.
Women, right, instead of just admitting that they have these fantasies, and by the way, men have such fantasies too.
Yeah, but
as
okay,
you say, they're okay to mention it, I guess. I don't know. I think a man might be a little embarrassed to say he'd like to be dominated by a woman, but never you mind. You're probably right on the whole. And if we move,
yeah, and the entire porn industry is also very much about rape, where the woman actually finds it very exciting and pleasurable. And a lot of young men are watching a great deal of porn, and the women are watching with them because that's what the men want them to do. And then they want the women to act out these scenarios that they're seeing. I mean, I think a lot of this rape culture thing is a response by women to the fact that they made a very bad bargain when they assented to the culture of promiscuity and hooking
Absolutely.
up.
Yeah,
and they now realize that they are getting the worst of this bargain. The men are very happy with it, and they are not happy. And that's why they drink so much. I think that these parties, the reason they get blind drunk is because they do not like what is happening to them, but they feel they must give assent to it because this is what makes them equal to men. But they are confused, angry, upset. They should be upset with themselves because they colluded this whole idea that sex is meaningless and that you could just have it without intimacy and as many partners as you like, and it doesn't mean anything. Guys can handle that concept very well. It plays into their natural sexuality, but it does not do anything for women except to harm them and to make them close off their emotions and their psychology and their need for intimacy. So I think women are confused and upset, and they've been misled by their ideological leaders, and they now find themselves in a bind that they can't get out of, and so they're blaming men.
Well, I agree. Sorry.
To be honest with you, I think that's a somewhat oversimplified view of male sexuality, but that's okay. I just wanted to say that. We don't need to debate it. I think there's some real truths to what you're saying.
I don't think that men that all men think that it's paradise to be, in a room with 10 women having sex with one right after the other. But when you hear boys talking, come on, we know that there is a sort of lowest common denominator there. There's plenty of men that are extremely put off by the idea of promiscuity or meaningless sex, and I don't mean to stereotype, but certain stereotypes do have a basis in reality. And also,
Barbara, one of the things I notice here, thanks to the whole of the rap movement, that you've got young boys who have girlfriends when they're on their own, and I've heard them do it, discussing their whores and bitches.
Yeah.
And this is a mindset because it's been going for so long.
Yeah. And who's the one? Who are the ones that are doing the slut shaming? When girls, we've had some very tragic incidents of girls attempting or actually committing suicide over the fact that they've been to parties, young girls, 15, 16.
Yeah. They've
had promiscuous sex. Pictures have been taken. They're on the internet or videos, and they're slut shamed. And some of the girls have very fragile psyches, anyways. But it's the girls that are doing the slut shaming. It's not just the guys. It's the girls that are initiating it.
It's true. There's nobody slut shames women more than women. I've seen it myself. Now, that said, I have another theory about why the rape culture hysteria, which, by the way, if anybody's curious, in the National Post, Barbara Kay recently wrote a very good article, very good commentary called "Rape Culture Fanatics Don't Know What a Culture Is." You might want to check that out on the National Post. Very good column. I have another theory as to why rape hysteria is so big right now in our politics and the news. And this is going to be my excuse to bring Attila Winzer on for a minute. One of my theories is feminists, ideological feminists for years have relied on the white knight impulse of men to protect women, which I think has both cultural and biological roots in it. And people just unquestioningly accept that domestic violence is primarily a male-on-female thing. Well, we know that this is not true. We have known from research that it's not true for quite some time. However, ideological feminists have managed to blockade the scientific and clinical evidence that it's not so, to an almost frightening degree, although that is beginning to change. I think because of the huge amount of research just keeps growing and growing and growing, and at some point, the credibility of these groups like the White Ribbon Campaign and a whole bunch of others based on this notion that it's women getting beat up, it's losing credibility everywhere. And that may actually be part of why they're saying, well, the writing may be on the wall on domestic violence. We realize that women can be violent, and child abuse especially is something women are at least as prone to commit as men, if not more so. And women are frequently violent, and people are starting to see that. And so maybe the ideological feminists are switching to rape just because they see the writing is on the wall and they can't keep exploiting the domestic violence issue forever. That would at least be my theory. I don't know if anybody agrees with it.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Because anything, as I said in the beginning, that's going to bring the money in, and it'll go. It also there's far less pictures of women with bruises in this country. It's more, the men are beating up the children, and there's pictures of bruised children. When we all know that women abuse far greater abusers of children than certainly biological fathers are. The safest place for a child has always been with its biological father, and the second most dangerous place is the boyfriend. I don't know if the figures hold true in Canada, do they, Barbara?
Yes, I know those facts to be true, but they don't make much headway. You don't see it much.
Well,
no, you won't.
We're working hard to change it, and there's certainly on A Voice for Men, certainly with this radio show, and with certain other groups we work with in Canada, they're pushing hard. And I happen to know from having to talk to people like Professor Don Dutton at the University of British Columbia, the young students coming out of university now are hearing the message that male victims of domestic violence are not a rarity, and violent women are not a rarity, and their open-mindedness to it. So a lot of these ideological feminists who came out of university in the 70s, 80s, and to some extent the 90s are going to be supplanted by younger women and a few men who are not buying that message either. On the issue of domestic violence, we have here on the line Attila Winzer from the Toronto area, and I want to have him tell us a little bit about a symposium that he is having in Toronto in early June. Attila, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, Erin. Hello, Barbara.
Hi.
I believe you and Barbara know each other somewhat, Attila?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. In fact, I recall very distinctly at the Parental Alienation Symposium in 2009 is when I actually had the pleasure of meeting Barbara personally, and I've admired the work that you do, Barbara. You are an incredible breath of air for society. I'm sure you hear this all the time, but I can't imagine the world without you and the writing that you do. It's just
that's very kind.
amazing.
Thank you. Thank you, Attila.
So some years ago, I was invited to a Children's Aid Society domestic violence symposium or a conference. And what I saw there just was absolutely appalling. As I've listened to you converse throughout this radio show, the consensus was, and the keynote speaker drove a message home, that it is men who are responsible for domestic violence. that they cause all the distress in the family, that they beat their wives, that they beat the mothers, that they beat children. And I just documented everything. I couldn't believe how incredibly wrong that information was. There was 600 women's shelter executives and CAS executives. And at that time, rather than standing up in outrage, I made a decision that I would produce a symposium that would actually bring about truth of what domestic violence is, which is not a women's issue, it's a family issue. So I am very, very pleased that this has finally come to fruition and reality. We in Toronto this June 6th and 7th will have Erin Pizzey and Professor Martin Theobert as our keynote speakers, beneath which we will have others such as Professor Miles Gross, Robert Franklin, and other amazing professionals who will address on Friday to an audience of geared towards professionals such as lawyers, MDs, police officers, judiciary, because what I have seen as a very serious problem is that police officers, and I know men, they are mandated to arrest the male as a principal modus operandi. And they do this for liability reasons, and then they allow the courts to deal with whatever else may come of it. And this is devastating to the family, because what it does is typically, as I said, the male is arrested. That's the last time that he entered his home. There's an ex parte restraining order issued quite easily. They hand them out like candy at the store. And we need to bring a truthful reality to what domestic violence really is. It does exist, but it is not existent in the manner in which society has been made to believe that it is. It's big business, and in fact, at the Children's Aid conference, domestic violence conference, I even interviewed an individual who was selling psychotropic drugs to the Children's Aid halfway houses, etc., as a measure to control these children.
Well, Attila, let me ask you. You just mentioned that there's this whole anti-male bias that is pervasive. I can tell you it's the same in the U.S., although in some places it's better than others. There's this pervasive anti-male attitude on the domestic violence issue all throughout Canada. You just know that all these professionals have been highly resistant to any counter message. Yet you're putting together this symposium. Do you expect these professionals to show up and listen to what is said there?
I not only expect them to show up, I will insist that they show up. In addition to that, our politicians also need to show up. Our MPs and MPPs, who are quite responsible for creating an environment that we are sitting in today. And it is, and I really despise this cliche, in the best interest of the children. It is everything but in the best interest of the children when you tear apart a family needlessly.
So how many people are you expecting at this symposium?
I would like to see as many people at this symposium as there was at the CAS conference. So somewhere between 400 and 600 people is what I expect to have at this event. The maximum capacity is 700. And there are enough people, professionals, there's enough victims of false domestic violence allegations. I'm one of them. That this is an absolutely imperative event where we need to flesh out what is going on, what is domestic violence, and we need to demand. We need to get our neighbors, our friends, to demand that changes be made, because as it stands today, it is devastating the family unit, which comprises our society. We're in tatters.
I believe I recall you telling me in a previous conversation that you already have commitments from a number of people who work in these departments and within the organizations to attend. So I expect that it's going to be a success. That said, it is good if we get word out and let people know, which is why I invited you to call in today.
Yeah, just lastly, the information will be available at torontodv.com. So that's torontodv.com. And we're expecting to have that website up and running in the coming days.
All right, excellent, Attila. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be doing my best to attend that.
I'll be there.
Yep.
I wish I could be. I'm going to be far, far away at that time, but I certainly would have liked to be able to attend that. I'm sure it'll be. Hope it will be very well attended.
Well, hopefully we can coax you into mentioning it to people anyway, Barbara. That I'm sure you can help spread the word a little bit about it.
I will certainly write at least a blog post on it, if not a column.
That would be awesome.
Thank you, Barbara.
I much appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, interestingly, I just got a message from Dan Perrins, who's another one of our Canadian activists. It's like, I'm a Yank, but every time I turn around, I'm seeing another Canadian. Just got a message from Dan Perrins, who's from Hamilton in Ontario. And he wanted me to ask you about something, Barbara. He wanted to ask me to ask, and I didn't see this, a woman named Kinsella. A repentant Kinsella says if women are able to do all the good things that men can do, then why do we as a society deny that women can do the bad too? Is this an interview?
Yes, I remember that case. She was a woman who had perpetrated quite serious abuse on her partner, if I'm recalling. And she, it was a case written up by somebody Brown at quite a number of years ago. Am I correct?
Let's see. I'm looking at it now. It's on the National Post, and I don't see a date on it. But it's called Fed on Myths, Preying on Men.
Yes, that's the one. I wrote about her in a column, and she herself had been an abuser, and she was quite repentant about it. And this was back in the days when you would hardly ever find a woman to admit to that. I think that I wrote that column some years ago, so I'm trying to remember all the details.
Well, the very fact that you were able to publish it and get it get people to read it and know about it is significant enough. I hope to see more of that. Did you write about these issues in your book? Which I think we mentioned that already. Acknowledgments, a cultural memoir, and other essays.
Yes, one of the essays in there is actually a talk I gave at the Canadian Association for Equality at the University of Toronto, and it was a talk I gave on the family court system and fathers' rights and how they're abused.
Well, excellent. Anybody who's going to be at that symposium, there's a good chance I'll be there too. Erin will almost certainly be there. She's scheduled to be. Did he say Marty Fiebert's going to be opening that?
Yeah, which would be great.
Marty's great. We had an interview with Marty late last year, so you might want to look through our radio archives or on our YouTube channel. That was a really good discussion.
He did the big meta study on domestic. Yeah.
Oh yeah, which he updates regularly.
Mm-hmm.
He has a new edition of his meta. If anybody doesn't know, a meta study means a review of all existing literature or most existing literature on domestic violence. And if you actually go into and search Google for Martin Fiebert and Fiebert, you'll find that's the first thing that comes up. References examining assaults by women on their spouses or partners, and the latest version came out just this last year. And there's just last year, 2013. And there's just no questioning it anymore. There is no rational questioning it anymore. The best the ideological feminists can do is claim that somehow when women hit men, that's still patriarchy because they're
self-defense.
It's always self-defense. Even if he's asleep and she uses a knife, it's must be self-defense, right? You've even got a crazy law professor up there at the University of Ottawa named Elizabeth Sheehy, who more or less says that. Shoot a man in the back of the head may be a moral imperative. Like, what?
She would like to see the law protecting women who kill without provocation. I can just imagine what a gate that would open.
Yeah, well, we have that in England. We've got a whole group called, I've forgotten the names now, actually, Justice for Women, that's it. Now they believe that all women who kill men and should be considered political prisoners and therefore not guilty. And they spend their time trying to get women out of jail who have cold-bloodedly murdered their men.
Wow.
Yep, and they're very effective.
Here in Michigan, we have a group called the Women's Clemency Project, which is devoted to that very thing. They're right now here in the state of Michigan in the U.S. trying to get off a woman who whacked her husband on the head with an axe 12 times. Because, I don't know, apparently we're supposed to ask, what on earth did that man do to deserve to be hit in the head with 12 times with an axe? It must have been something terrible, eh?
I think you have to understand that a lot of these women have suffered tremendous abuse. The question is, it usually takes two to tango, and why do these women, were they attracted to these guys in the first place, and why do they stay with them?
Can I just answer that, love? Barbara,
yes,
something
do.
I realized very, very early on when the refuge started filling up with women from across the country, and I saw women walk to their death, and I'd say, but you told me, he said, if you go back, he'll kill you. And why are you going back? Why are you taking the children? Until I actually realized, I came across something that Freud had said about 100 years ago. He actually said, in time, all emotions will be found in chemicals of the brain. And that's the moment, it's like an eureka moment, I thought, yeah. And I used to say to women, think of him as your heroin pusher. Think of him that you are addicted to this man, and your only way out of this, I say it to men as well, is that you have to go cold turkey. Because as one woman wrote a little note to me before she went back, and she said, I always told you if I heard his voice, like the Pied Piper, I'd have to go back. And she died. And wow. I have never forgotten her. And I've never forgotten what she said. And you have to look.
You wrote about that. Now it's coming back to me. Yes, it is an addiction, isn't it?
Yeah. And everybody gets so angry with women when they keep, or men, yes, keep going back. And they get so hostile. And I kept saying, but we're not asking the right question. What is the question? Why? And the answer is simply, it is no difficult to alcohol or drugs. It is a different form of addiction. And it's deadly. And it destroys generations of children.
I can almost hear Dr. Tara Palmadier's voice. We've had her on the show as well, and undoubtedly will again. She spends most of her time in her clinical practice dealing with men who are in abusive relationships. And I can almost hear her saying, you're right, because quite often it's difficult to get a man to leave a woman who's just being hideously, emotionally, and even physically abusive. What's strange in men, and she will back this up, and I think you might, Erin, I don't know, maybe you've seen more extreme cases, so it's not like this. She's actually got mentioned to me before that she has a problem getting men to even recognize that the woman who is spitting on them, scratching them, slapping them, and throwing them things at them, getting them to even recognize that there's something abusive about that behavior. It's almost, she says that they often don't even recognize it.
Well, you know why, Dean? Because that's how they were treated as children by their mothers.
You know what? That's not always the case. We had a case here in Canada not long ago, one of the most horrifying things ever. A young woman bent on marrying a man whose sadism was well recognized. She was a perfectly normal seeming woman. She'd been brought up in a normal household. Her parents, her friends, her co-workers all said, do not marry that man. He is abusive. We can tell from the way you're acting. You've got bruises on you. They staged an intervention. They did everything possible. She married him. Not only was he was beyond physically abusive, but they found her, she went through horrible abuse and each time protected him. I won't go into the whole long story, but in the end, he ended up pouring boiling water all over her. And for 11 days, she stayed She didn't call anybody. When her mother called her, she said, "Oh, I've got the flu." She had the most agonizing. She was infected, and finally she died. And nobody can figure out how.
Barbara,
Yes.
can I just say something? In her case, she couldn't have had a normal upbringing. It may have looked normal, everybody, but quite honestly, what happened there is her pain and pleasure were crossed, and she was getting pleasure out of pain, and that's a very hard thing for women to admit to. So many women can only orgasm in pain, and once they can
be something that comes just to an individual without I mean, perhaps it's something genetic? Does it have to be her parents' fault? Does it have to be?
No, I don't think it does, because in some cases, for instance, a procedure in a hospital at an early age, all sorts of other factors can come into it. But whatever it was that made her into somebody who, in a sense, welcomed pain, and that's what I think was happening. This is why it's got to come out of court.
What else? I mean, you certainly couldn't explain it in any other way except some dreadful genetic or chemical, misfiring.
Yeah, I agree. But if somebody perhaps had understood it, I mean, there are times when I've had to say to a woman who yet for the 9th time she comes in and a cigarette burns and all the rest on top of it, just say to her, what is this because the only way you get sexual pleasure is when you're experiencing pain? And, it's so sad sometimes because that women will say to you, I never told anybody because nobody asked the right question. Yeah?
And it's such a horrible taboo area. And yet, if what you're saying is true, and I have more faith in your expertise on this than anybody alive, Erin, but if what you are saying is true, then this is a taboo that needs breaking fast. I mean, being afraid to talk about it should be like being afraid to disrobe in front of your doctor. I mean, how can you possibly help somebody who refuses to let you look under your shirt? You know what I mean? I mean,
but this, I think probably in the case of many women, the reason they don't talk to anybody about it is because they see it as part of the love they have. I mean, when you see behavior that may appear wrong to other people, but in your eyes it's an expression of your love, then you're able to see it in, I mean, as macabre as it seems, you can see it in a positive light because it shows how much more loving you are than most other people.
Oh, I've seen that even in classical literature. Man, I'm forgetting the book. This book was at least 200 years old, and it was a story about some woman who, no matter how much a man abused her, she proved her love by staying faithful to him no matter what, and she was made out to be a heroine because of that sort of thing. And I don't think that's a culture of hating women. I think it's kind of pointing to what you're talking about, the kind of sick mindset, just like these men I've talked about, who can't even see. Every man I know who's taken abuse, just about. There are some exceptions, right? They're the smart ones. Well, I don't even want to use the word smart. They're the ones who, maybe not the first time, but the second or third time she throws a brick at him, figures out that he better leave. But of the ones who don't, they invariably think they must have done something to deserve it, or that they must not be loving her well enough, or something like that. And they see taking the abuse as heroic. That's what a lot of the men.
And also, Dean, an awful lot of men are in an even worse position than women when they try and leave, because they know they also know that A, they've got nowhere to go, and B, they're going to be leaving the children with a maniac, and that's one of the reasons they stay, to protect their children. And as you've said, though, in both with men and women, there are differences and there's similarities, but the one thing that matters is when you actually have to say to a man or woman, I want you to stop using the word love, because nobody is loving you when they stub cigarettes out on you or pour boiling water between your legs or whatever the atrocities are. This is not love. And you're talking to someone who hasn't known anything about love. Abuse is actually often all they've ever known. Women will cry and say, I didn't know I was a battered woman. Well, of course she didn't. She came from that background.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the same with the men. It's the same with the men.
Yeah.
But the only thing that breaks my heart on that one, it's part of why I consider myself a men's activist, because you do get, I mean, men are just as likely to be perpetrators as victims, and as such, they're just as likely to be victims as perpetrators.
Yeah.
And usually it's something that goes two ways, but something you just said there is one of the reasons why I do this work and focus on men myself is the men have nowhere to go.
That's right.
One of my best friends in the world, I cannot name him, but one of my best friends in the world stayed for years in a relationship where his wife was savagely beating him and his children, and his reason for staying was to protect the children with the full knowledge that if he went to the police, he would go to jail.
Yep.
And then nobody would be there to protect the children. Now, I'm happy. I don't know if I want to exactly use the word happy. All right, happy to say that she eventually got over her own anger impulses, and according to him, hasn't been that way for some years. But he and the children went through years of it, and he couldn't do anything except find a way to put his head down and somehow keep her calm. And this is a brutal reality that, well,
I think one of the most brutal realities that actually happen, it happens both ways again, but often it happens to fathers, is that they know that when they leave, the wife will make it her business to twist the children's vision of who he is from her own perspective. And not only will they physically lose their children, but they will emotionally lose their children, often forever. And that, I get so upset when men in their 60s and 70s are still absolutely bereft because they've never managed to build that bridge back to their children as much as they've always loved them.
Well, I think what we're seeing. I mean, I hear a lot of stories. I get so much mail from men, and although the details vary, the basic premise is exactly what you've been talking about. And it always, when the woman does get evaluated, even if it's a court-ordered evaluation, it always seems to be the same diagnosis of borderline personality disorder.
Yeah, that's right.
So that seems to be the common denominator, but it's not something that judges in a court, say, would routinely, the same as parental alienation syndrome. I mean, they're not tuned into patterns of behavior that indicate an actual disorder. They always think that, oh, she's very angry. Well, what's her reason? She must have a reason. Obviously nobody just gets angry and starts hating their partner for no reason at all. But yes, they do if they have a disorder. And that seems to be the one that keeps cropping up.
Well, but because violence is generational, so as it comes down the generations, I can sit down three sides of my family. I can trace it back to great-grandparents. So my feeling is that as it comes down, you create, because there's no intervention. The whole point of the refuge and the movement that I believed would follow, but it didn't, was that the women coming in, and the men who we also took care of, the women coming in would actually have an intervention and could learn and to change the brain patterns that they had damaged, being marinated in violence, if you like. That's the only way it's going to change.
Yeah. Acknowledge it and talk about it and
treat it.
Yeah, although and didn't you tell? You've mentioned this before, Erin. When is this happening again? You're going to, was it Portugal?
No, I can't go because I'm not healthy enough. I'm doing the Skype conference in Portugal with a conference there, and
but it's people who are looking to build a treatment model for domestic violence.
That's right.
Rather than throw the man out because he must have done something nonsense that we know doesn't work and just makes things worse.
Well, I've always had a treatment model, and I still use it today. And it's about understanding generational violence. And the first and foremost that to remember is that domestic violence, exposure, violence, and sexual abuse damages children's brains, and you leave them damaged forever, and they continue to pass that damage on. Once we can get the governments to understand that it's generational violence, that there has been a fraudulent lie for 40 years, which is called patriarchy, then we can begin to heal people.
Amen. I hope you're right. All right, ladies, we've been going just about an hour and 20 minutes. It's about time to start wrapping up the show. Barbara, is there anything else you'd like to mention or talk about?
Well, we've covered quite a lot of, we've covered quite a few bases, the main bases. I don't think I have anything on my back burner right now that's pressing.
Well, you are going to be coming to the Detroit conference at the end of June in Detroit.
Yes, and I'll be speaking about misandry and the media.
Misandry and the
Great,
media.
I'll be looking forward to meeting you. That'll be wonderful.
It'll be fun. I think I'm looking forward to meeting people, giants in the field that Warren Farrell, who I've, read his books and admired him so long. He'll be there, and I have met some of the key players, at conferences. But
Warren Farrell, Senator Ann Cools.
I've met Senator Cools, but I'm sure there's other people that I haven't met.
Miles Groth, a Carnell Smith, who's an amazing man with an amazing story about, and who does a lot of work on paternity fraud, which is something everybody doesn't talk about. Obviously, I'll be there, which is the main reason for anybody to come, of course. No, we're going to have quite a few. Mike Buchanan is coming over from the UK to talk about what he's doing there. We've got a contingent coming from Australia. We've got a contingent coming from India. So you guys should check the front page of A Voice for Men for details on that. I would also encourage everybody to read the National Post in Canada.
Yay!
Exclusively for Barbara Kay's column, and make sure to let them know you're reading because you love Barbara Kay, because we love her too.
That's so great.
And I think we'll call it quits for this week. Erin, you want to say anything else before we close?
No, I just think that was a wonderful program, and Barbara, I really enjoyed sharing things with you. It was lovely.
Me too. I can see that we have many things in common, and we think alike on so many issues, and I really do look forward to meeting you and giving you a big hug.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
You'll have to get in line for that one. And I'll just say for both of you, it does this man's heart a great deal of good to hear women actually do give a damn about these things. We need you. All right, James. Well, next week we'll be here at this same usual time with Tales from the Infrared, our show with Christian Schiessen, where I don't know what we'll be talking about, except it'll be something to do with geek culture and sci-fi and such. And in 2 weeks, we'll be back here with Erin and speaking to a Professor Nicola Graham-Kavan, who is a Swedish, actually she's from Sweden, but she's based in both Sweden and the UK, all about domestic violence and her research and her run-ins with feminists. So look forward to that in 2 weeks. Good night, everybody. And James, if you would, take us home. You have been listening to Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and me, her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music and closing music is known as Sunshine and Eternal Hope, respectively, and is by Kevin MacLeod and used under Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also want to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and all of those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, if you're a victim of domestic violence, no matter if you're a man or a woman, gay or straight, adult or child, no matter what your race, your ethnicity, your religious views, your sexual orientation, or anything else, what you went through or are going through now is not okay. You should not be afraid to talk about it with people who understand and care. Just remember to talk to people who do understand and not to ideologues who fear the truth or will marginalize you and your experiences. Remember, the truth about domestic abuse is often painful to hear, especially to ideologues, and especially to those who've been through it and been marginalized and ignored. But remember, in truth, there is hope and healing, and we hope you'll be a part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time on Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey, and yours truly, Dean Esme. God bless.